first of all, I want to thank Aiken Gum for providing us with this beautiful, beautiful venue. It really is it's fabulous. And thank Monroe over at Aiken Gum for arranging this. I also thank them for letting the sun break through at the very right time of the day so we can look at this gorgeous view. Let me also thank Bruce here, Cornerstone Acquisitions, for helping us fund our portion of this program. This is the 50th anniversary of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And as part of that 50th anniversary, we run 5 Track 2 dialogues. We run one on strategic matters, we run one on economic matters, one on maritime. Rich Perry's here, so yes, Rich, we run one on maritime, we run one on human rights and rule of law, and then we run this one. And this one is terrific for me for a bunch of reasons. One is we do it in this extraordinary venue that CEFC provides us, which happens to be in Trump Tower with views in every direction. It's truly the most magnificent venue that we have for any Track 2. The other is because we gather a group of experts that is really impressive. On our website is in fact a full list of everyone who attends these. But what we decided is when we have all of these experts coming, and we do it in closed meetings, so we have 2 days of closed meetings, but what we decided is it was valuable during these 2 days of closed meetings to have a few hours that's open so we can use the expertise of the people who participate in this dialogue to have a public program, and that's exactly what we're doing today. So normally, when a speaker gets ill or drops out, I have a tough time replacing them. But here, Ed Cunningham got the flu this morning, and we quickly, within 10 seconds, replaced him with an equally able person in Joanna Lewis. So, and I could have taken any of the other 16 people who participate in this and used them for the public portion. But we've settled on these 4. You've got the agenda and you've got their bio, so I won't spend a lot of time going over that. Let me just introduce my partner in this endeavor, Professor Zhuang, who is with CEFC, and once again thank CEFC for bringing this extraordinary group of energy experts from China to talk about an issue that is important to China, important to the United States, and important to U.S.-China relations. Professor Zhuang.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Zhuang Jianzong from China Committee Center. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center. First of all, let me say a few words on behalf of Mr. Yi Jianming, the Chairman of China Energy Defense Committee, as well as the President of Huaxin Energy Company Limited, to extend our warm welcome and sincere appreciation for your participation of this unique event. As we all know, at the end of last year, the Paris Climate Conference ended successfully, marking a new beginning in energy history. From a fossil energy age to a new energy, renewable energy. So it will have a great many aspects, implications to mankind as well as human life. At the beginning of this year, China convened 2 sessions issuing the new 13th five-year plan. In that plan, we decided to build a new energy system. So I think these two things closely related. It will have a great, profound impact on the history of energy. Here, we have undergoing the shale gas revolution. We discussed it last year here. So I think that these two revolutions, as well as the new energy transition, will get together, affect the future of mankind. So we decided to have a seminar, a dialogue on the transition, especially on the US-China energy cooperation in the transition. Because we think that during that transition, US cooperation is not only necessary, but also very important to achieve the success of that transition. This morning, we invited some leading experts together to discuss the cooperation. We have the dialogue there. Now, here, this evening, we invite some of the keynote speakers to introduce their findings, to share with you their successful achievements. I think that it will not only let you know our success, but also contribute to the further strengthening of US-China cooperation. Now, first, let me show our former energy agency chief, Director Zhang Guobao, his video speech. Now, okay. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be invited to participate in the Energy Strategic Dialogue, Track 2, between China and the US. But unfortunately, I'm in hospital, so I can't come with you face-to-face dialogue. I want to explain my warm congratulations through this video and hope this dialogue will be successful. I also want to take this opportunity to explain 2 points. One is what is the relationship between China and the US in the energy field. The second, I want to brief China's 13th five-year plan, because last month, China's National People's Congress just approved this 13th five-year plan. Probably somebody interested in this five-year plan. I already read down my remarks. Later, I will ask my colleague to read my remarks. Thank you, everybody.
So you summarize those remarks?
Yes.
Yes. He will summarize the speech that Zhang Guobao is making.
Yeah, he just said China and the US now is the most important oil and gas consumer country, also the producer countries. Since we opened up for last 30 some years, China is really to looking for supply, secure our supply. And now China become the almost equal importer for the oil as the US. How the two country cooperations for the development, there are lots of communication between each other. We know the energy cooperation with 4 layers cooperation. First of all is the trading oil and gas. Second is the capital investment. Third is on the technology, communication and exchanges. The final is the human resources. Until now, China and the US have no big trading on the oil and the gas. And the investment between each other, some, but not very significant, the investment. But for the technology exchange and for the human being exchange, it's very much take place for last such some years. In the other effect, like the renewable on the solar, China become the biggest export for the element of the solar generated, but we have some confliction in there. And China and the US very different on the energy structure. China is still really very much based on the coal. US, due to the shale revolution, shale gas revolution, now heavily reduced the consumption of coal. And we're discussing the when China, the coal peak will come in. Mr. Zhang Guobao is really think we need to reduce our coal consumption heavily. Renewable in China is developed very fast for last 10 years. We become the biggest windmill and the solar installation. But compared with the whole consumptions, the solar and the windmill only 3%, only 3% of our total consumptions. US is more bigger, the percentage on the renewable. For the Chinese oil industry now is faced also big pressure on the energy transaction to reduce the coal and increase our gas consumptions. So since China and the US will more on trading later on, especially see how the LNG come to go to China, and also on Chinese private sector, quite a many people looking invest into US on the shale or shale gas, shale oil, and the tight oil. So we think for the cooperation will be take place in the future. The energy cooperation between US and China not only important for these two countries, also very helpful for the whole world, because we are the biggest two countries in economic size, in the energy consumptions, and also in the oil industry as well. So just like he said in the beginning, because he's in US right now, but it's for the healthy care. Houston, Boston, so cannot come here to address what he wants to say here. I just feel summary of remarks from his paper there. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll kick off the panel with Meghan O'Sullivan, who will talk about kind of the geopolitical energy situation. You got her full bio. If I read her full bio, we wouldn't have any time left for her remarks. But let it suffice to say she is a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and is about to come out with a book on the foreign policy implications of the new energy abundance. So a real expert. Thanks for being here, Meghan.
Thank you very much, Steve, and I'd like to thank the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and CEFC for hosting this dialogue. It's my second year participating, and I find it really valuable, a real great opportunity to sit with Chinese colleagues and have really meaningful exchange. Steve just asked if I'd spend 5 minutes, and I thought in those 5 minutes I will seek to make 4 points that I hope will allow us to have a larger conversation. The first, and this is something that was underscored by our conversation today, we talked about energy transitions, and the title of this panel is a global energy transition. But I don't really think that there's consensus on what the global energy transition is. In fact, it's one of those words or phrases, if you use it, the person you're speaking to could have something completely different in his or her mind. If you ask me what the global energy transition is, I'm likely to think it's a transition from a perceived world of scarcity to a perceived world of abundance. If you asked the average American, they'd probably say the transition has to do with the revolution in unconventional oil and gas. If you asked a lot of people, maybe in China, certainly our colleagues today, they would say the global energy transition is away from carbon-based fuels to a non-carbon future. And I just returned from the Middle East, and if you ask people in the Gulf there, they probably say the energy transition has to do with moving economies away from being so dependent on the energy sector. So the first point is just that this is a concept that means many different things to different people, and that's partially because there are many transitions going on, and they all interact with one another in ways we can discuss. My second point is that there are huge uncertainties with all of these transitions, but one thing we can be comfortable in knowing is that there will be big geopolitical implications of these transitions. And if you think about it, energy has always been a big driver of international politics and national security issues. This has been true, from as long as people have been burning wood. If you think about the transition of the wood to coal, and the big economic transition, the industrial revolution that brought with it. You think about the transition from coal to oil. I'm talking about being a dominant energy source. And you think about the post-World War II situation where Europe really dramatically shifted their primary energy source to oil, and the geopolitical implications it had for the world in terms of making the Middle East really a strategic arena. So we can be confident that these energy transitions that we're discussing will and are having serious geopolitical implications for how the world works, how countries interact with one another, alliances, and potential nodes of conflict. My third point is And I'm hoping someone will really challenge me on this. So this is my explicit invitation to you. But when I think about one of the most important of these energy transitions, which is the move towards a low carbon future, I think that unquestionably there'll be geopolitical ramifications of this shift. I feel it's a little early to anticipate exactly what that is going to look like, in part because we're in the early days of this transition, and in part because renewables, as one of my colleagues today underscored, renewables has certainly made they have made a big impact on energy mixes and how markets work within countries. But thus far, I would say there isn't a huge amount of renewable energy that is traded across borders. You know, most of internationally traded energy still tends to be oil, gas, and coal. But of course, you know, the transfer of technology has geopolitical implications. So I look forward to writing a book on that one day. And my last point has to do with where we have seen major geopolitical ramifications already, and that is in the unconventional revolution that's happened primarily but not exclusively here in the United States. Some people talk about that energy transition as being over, that revolution as being over, but I would really say we're still potentially in the early days. There's still a lot that is going to happen in that area, and already we've seen a change in how the world perceives U.S. interests to be in the Middle East. Again, I mentioned I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East this year so far, and there's certainly a widespread belief that the United States is less interested in the Middle East because of our own energy prowess. Certainly Russia and the economic problems that it has had as a consequence of a low oil price has influenced Russia's foreign policy behavior. In my view, I think made Putin and Russia inclined to be more aggressive outside of its borders. But I would say, looking at all of these geopolitical ramifications, the most important and most interesting ones are in the realm of the U.S.-China relationship. And we could go into this at great length. I'll just throw a few out there and hope that people will be interested in expanding on them. First, you know, I'm struck by, as recently as 2008, many experts thought that one of the biggest potential points of conflict for the world was going to be conflict over resource competition. The National Intelligence Council, which is a U.S. intelligence effort, they put out every 5 years a public document that is the best assessment that's written for the president or president-elect. It's the best assessment of the intelligence community, what the world is going to look like in 10 years. And the 2008 one basically was talking quite a bit about how competition for resources was likely to lead to conflict. And obviously China and the US were front and center there. But that now seems like stuff of Hollywood. So, you know, that's the first obvious change in that relationship. But I also think there's potentially a change in perception. It's very hard, I think, to really think that the United States is a country in terminal decline in the face of one of the most innovative energy revolutions that we've seen in a long time. So I'm curious and always interested to learn from my Chinese colleagues, you know, how the innovations here in the United States has affected Chinese strategic thinking about the U.S. and about whether or not the country is in decline. I would also say, and maybe Joanna will discuss this more, but it's opened, this unconventional revolution has opened new opportunities for the United States and China to cooperate. And I would say the U.S.-China climate agreement is a great example. It's hard to imagine the American side being able to come to the position that it has without, you know, in the absence of this surfeit of natural gas. And then finally, to look to the future, I'm hoping that we can look at these energy changes we're seeing and see them as a spur, an impetus for greater U.S.-Chinese cooperation in stabilizing the Middle East. So that's a little bit of a futuristic vision, but one that I don't think is too early to discuss. And with those 4 points, I'll turn it back over to Steve. Thank you.
One of the pleasures of this dialogue is having gotten, over the last 3 years, to know Chen Weidong, who he has just retired as the chief energy researcher of the the Energy Economic Institute of CNOOC. But even when he was employed by CNOOC, his frankness and directness in talking about China's energy policy was something we all deeply appreciated. So we look forward to hearing your remarks. And I hope I haven't gotten you in trouble.
Thank you. Today, talk most about in the energy sector, low oil price. That's American unconventional revolution cost low oil price. Also, because China huge demand for the oil and gas, drive the oil price goes up from 2002 since 2002, because the Chinese demand driver oil price goes high, that drive the U.S. unconventional revolution happens. So actually China don't know in that time the low price is due to us demand, is due to the shale revolutions here. That's one thing. American shale revolution is really impact the whole oil and gas industry for the energy transactions. First, the U.S. unconventional revolution is really increase the supply. For last 5 years, every year, 1 million barrels per day increase. So American, since 2011 up now, go back to the top every day over 10 million barrels production rate. That's back to the top again. But for the last 5 years, the whole demand increased only about 3 million barrels per day. So the increased production more than the increase of the demand. The demand slowed down due to China economic go to new normal. The consumption decreased. So this is the logic behind. Actually, China and the US did not have any cooperation go together to drive the oil price low. Actually, the oil price low make a very complex how to evaluate the low price, how big benefits the China and the US get, and also very difficult to evaluate how much difficult made for the low oil price make for our oil industry for both countries. Also affect a lot of other businesses as well. But the low price is really changed the oil price decision mechanism. Before, the oil price has the benchmark price in the OPEC. They also is so-called swing producers. But the US shale revolution shift the swing producer from Middle East to US. How predict the fall of the oil price really depend on how the balance is, when the balance come in, the producer, the demand. The price now is really depend on the marginal benefits or marginal profits or marginal income of the US tiger oil and shale oil. when the oil price drop below the cost, many U.S. company will stop producing. So the producer will less, the oil will goes up. But when the oil price goes up, more American shale, tight oil will reproduce. The oil price goes up. So the benchmark of the oil price will really shift to what I just said, the marginal cost, the marginal benefit of American shales. So on these citizens, how China and U.S. cooperation, China will for sure import more oil and gas. Even the demand grows slow, but the absolute demand will continue, goes up. So no matter ever, just like Zhang Guobao said, the two countries is so important, not only for the cooperation on the oil industry, also many, just like you said, Middle East. Middle East, before Middle East is a main producer, the income is from the oil. No matter the low oil price or the energy transaction, they will affect Middle East heavily. So how China, US can cooperate to enhance to try to solve the issues there. We are not have much dialogue with them. But China have no confidence in the area. Yeah, for sure. Not like USA. US have to be there now. But China still have the choose, they cannot step in. But the Middle East is still the most important supply for China, or even the gas demand now. So this is one thing. Second, because energy transaction and also the unconventional revolution cost here, the energy, the global energy, how say, the government system, because this market change, demand change, the government system also changed. So how China, US can have more dialogue on that, the world energy government system. US always being the leader, but still being the leader, not only on the production, also on the technologies, and also on many ways. And China become the biggest energy consumers. Also, China have to participate into the world energy government system fully or more active. So I think on many ways, before China, US only take care of their own interest on the energy intentions, but now we realized we need a more dialogue corporate to face more challenges in the future on the oil industry.
Thank you. In addition to Joanna's many accomplishments, being on the faculty at Georgetown, now affiliated with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, not on her resume is that she is a public intellectual of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Huh?
It's on the longer version.
It's on the longer version, not on this short version. That is a program that we run which seeks to identify America's outstanding young China experts and persuade them to do things just like Joanna is doing today, which is educate the public on issues relating to China. Joanna.
Thank you. So I thought for my remarks this evening, I would reflect a bit on three important trends that we are seeing in China's energy sector, and particularly in the U.S.-China energy cooperation. First, that China is the global center of clean energy development, and the tides are really starting to turn in China's coal-based energy sector. Second, that U.S.-China clean energy cooperation has really expanded in scope and depth over the past 7 years and made some, I think, really major achievements, both domestically and internationally. And then third, the bilateral cooperation between the two countries has really been able to transform global action on key topics like climate change, and that I think this relationship is going to be increasingly important going forward in shaping global issues. So starting with the first area, I think we now see China really is indeed the global center of clean energy deployment, increasingly innovation as well. Last year, China invested over $110 billion in the clean energy space. That's out of about $328 billion worldwide, so China is the largest investor in this area. And while some of the other panelists mentioned that clean energy is still small in total share, it's still not heavily traded between nations, it is where the most money is going in terms of new annual investments. So on an incremental basis, this is a really big shift, and this is no longer a niche industry. And in China, of course, while the energy mix is still dominated by coal, we see a real shift just in the last 2 years, really, in terms of the new power plant capacity that's being built. So we've seen coal use decline for the last 2 years. For the past 2 years, or I should say last year in 2015, for example, if you look at just the new power plants that were built in China, 63% of capacity, installed capacity, was non-fossil. So that's primarily wind, followed by hydro, and then followed by solar and nuclear fourth. So that's a real change, where you go back 10 years ago, we were looking at China building almost 100 gigawatts a year of new coal plants. That number has dropped dramatically. So new plants are being built, but really at a much slower rate. And then, of course, when we look at the numbers on coal consumption, it is down for the last 2 years, which again I think caught many by surprise. We see a drop about 3% in 2014 and almost 4% last year. And this has really led many to speculate, as others mentioned, of whether China has reached a peak in its coal consumption, and this, of course, would have significant implications for the carbon dioxide emissions trajectory, which China may be on, and targets that it's put forward. When we look at the INDC, China's contributions to the climate negotiations, as well as the targets coming out in the 13th Five-Year Plan, many of which are quite aggressive in the clean energy space, these new numbers and coal trends really put China on a very good path to meet these targets, and perhaps years ahead of schedule. So looking at what's been happening in U.S.-China clean energy cooperation in particular, thinking back to 2009, sort of the Obama administration came into office, there were a whole new set of agreements signed at that point by then President Hu. One of those, you may recall, was the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which has really, I think, been a new model for U.S.-China cooperation in this space. It launched it's really the most extensive type of cooperation we've seen in this area, where we have a lot of dialogues and we have a lot of meetings, but this is a multi-agency, multi-sector research initiative. It brings together universities from both sides, national laboratories, private companies, to conduct research and development in the areas of advanced coal, advanced efficient building technology, and advanced clean vehicle technology. And they just launched a fourth area looking at the energy-water nexus. And so this has really been, I think, a way that we see the countries engaging in a pretty meaningful way, facilitated by governments, but really being carried out by many other actors. That is a model that's making progress on issues, ranging from technology innovation to intellectual property protection. And then the 2013 U.S.-China Working Group on Climate Change was also a new initiative that was launched when Secretary Kerry entered the State Department, and it was really the first time that we had a sort of high-level dialogue just on climate change between the two countries. We we've been cooperating on energy for many years, but this, of course, was a new opportunity, a new platform to essentially have an open conversation sort of leading into Paris and making sure that both leaders could sort of have a conversation when necessary to ensure that things were moving constructively towards the Paris outcome. Which leads me to my last point, which is that I think this bilateral cooperation and the evolution of it just over the last 6-7 years or so has really been able to transform global action on key topics. And of course, climate change is the most well-known success story here. The Paris Agreement, I think, really would not be possible, have been possible, had the leaders not been in a position to come out with a November 2014 joint announcement where both the United States and China previewed many of the national targets, which would then be put forth in their commitments in Paris. Since then, we've seen 2 more presidential statements, as well as a city-level summit of leaders come together and really start to think about how are we going to implement these targets domestically. And most recently, just last week, there was a new presidential announcement on climate change in the hallways of the nuclear summit, where we saw a mention of, I think, some of the topics that are interesting to look at going forward. I would say this is sort of a list of where the U.S. and China still need to work together, to cooperate, and where they can really help shape the global conversation. One is on the Montreal Protocol and looking at these sort of high-potency greenhouse gases, which are sort of not yet being addressed in the Climate Convention. Another is sort of the role of the G20 going forward, and of course, with China hosting, it'll be an interesting, it'll be an important opportunity for sort of further action on climate change after Paris. And then finally, I think that the ongoing dialogue between both countries and sort of in the context of the global dialogue about climate finance and how financing from both governments, not just through sort of traditional climate funds, but sort of the broader use of public resources to finance and encourage the transition to low carbon economies. So the role that sort of both countries are playing in shaping, whether it's sort of the new AIIB investments or Exim Bank investments and others, I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. We can't solve climate change, even as sort of both countries are starting to move away from coal and beginning these revolutions and energy transitions. There's many other countries that I think both the U.S. and China can play an important role in cooperating with and helping with that transition as well. Thank you.
Those of you who've heard me give kind of my general lecture on U.S.-China relations know that I talk about 2 trends that make me optimistic in the mid and long term. One is Chinese investment in the United States, which I think is a new trend that's going to build stronger relations between the 2 countries. By the way, we have programs next Tuesday in Washington and Wednesday in New York on that subject. The other is the 304,000 Chinese graduates, undergraduates and graduate students now studying in the United States. Yadong is the perfect example of why that can strengthen the relationship. That beginning his education in China, his graduate education in America, and the role he plays in kind of the energy sector and in kind of being president of CEFC America is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say that these 304,000 students now in the United States are going to change the fabric of the relationship. And the successor generations to Dr. Liu are going to change the way the United States and China interact.
Thank you, Steve. I was given the task of saying a good word about the parent company whose generosity makes events like this possible. So I will use 1 out of the 5 minutes I was given. It's very short. CEFC stands for China Energy Fund company for the parent. It was started some 14 years ago by Mr. Jeane, who is now our chairman. The company is based in Shanghai, and it's 2 large business groups in Shanghai and Beijing, with a total workforce of over 20,000 people. CEFC began as an energy trading company, and today still has energy as a core business. recent years, it has acquired a lot of financial assets, not to go into finance as a second business, but to integrate finance with energy so as to bring down the cost of our energy business and to grow the company faster. In both 2014 and 15, CEFC was named a global Fortune 500 company. Also, CEFC was ranked number 8 among private Chinese companies last year. The Chinese for CEFC is Huaxin. Hua refers to China or Chineseness, and Xin means credibility. It gives you an idea of the kind of company Chairman wants to build. Now, with that out of the way, there's a lot of discussion already of the kind of energy transitions that we're in and the possible areas for cooperation. I like to pick on one. That is, first of all, the energy transition coincides with another transition in China. That's the economic transition. It's from investment-led high growth to hopefully consumption-driven, moderate to low growth economy. And so whatever positive implications the energy transition has is happening at a time when the Chinese economy is actually going through a lot of difficulties. So it's in that sense, it's not an easy transition for China to experience. One of the things that the leadership had planned to do is to look beyond the Chinese borders for investment and business opportunities to help kind of soak up the excess capacity, if you will. So President Xi came up with the idea, the initiative of one belt, one road, or one road, one belt. I don't know how many of the people present here have heard about that initiative or idea. It's basically, it's kind of an egg-shaped circle for the, there's one maritime route that begins from southern China through Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean to Africa. And then there is a land-based route that begins from central China, again through Asia, Central Asia, and it ends in Rome. So it's kind of, it's almost a circle. And the Chinese leadership thinks that there is a lot of opportunities in this area, and it's a huge area. And depending on how you calculate, you're talking about over 50 countries along the route, and their total population is over 60% of the global population, with the economy about the aggregate GDP is about 30% of the world. So you're talking about a large region with a lot of potential opportunities, and it just so happens that a lot of the countries along the route still has a lot to go in terms of infrastructure and energy development. And so this is a very important opportunity for the Chinese leadership. Now, my experience here is that a lot of people here in the US have not heard about it, and those who have heard about it tend to treat it with quite a dose of skepticism, cynicism, and to some extent even hostility, because a lot of them think of this as China's attempt to dump excess capacity. To some extent, that is true. And some people think of this as China's effort to expand its sphere of influence, and to some extent, that's also true. But regardless of the geopolitical considerations, I think there is a compelling economic imperative for the Chinese leadership to push into this region. And China has the benefit, the advantage of geography and low-cost capital. So I think the chances are it will happen one way or the other, and it's a matter of degree, matter of the extent, not a matter of whether or not it will happen. So in this area, I would like to think that rather than standing on the sidelines or even resisting China's effort to push into this region, maybe there are ways for U.S. to be actively involved, so as to help shape how the next phase of the economy looks like in some of these countries, at least, especially in terms of their infrastructure development and so on. And just because of the size of the economy and the size of the population, I think how these countries develop in the next stage will actually have a big impact on global economy, not just the economy, on the climate as well. So I think that's an area where China and the U.S. can easily incorporate into the existing strategic and economic dialogue. And we have, there are so many venues for the two countries to add that as part of energy cooperation. Thank you.
Well, let me kick it off with a few questions. I guess the first one for Meghan and Chen Weidong. Meghan, you talked about kind of the marginal producer. Talk a little bit about the lag time. In other words, obviously you can't, price drops today, you can't decide I'm not producing. So what a price drop and then when production actually starts to slow. So talk a little bit about that. And as part of that, Meghan, talk about what does this mean for kind of America reaching the point where our imports and exports of energy are equal? And does that really mean anything?
Yeah, this due to the American shale revolution, shale oil or unconventional revolution, or shale oils type of oil. They are mainly on the land, on land productions. And the shale oil and the shale gas is easy on and off. No need to like the conventional oil. They have the big investment for long term, like the deep water, the big oil field. Here, the unconventional, the revolution is no conventional oil and the gas production. They're looking for the reserve. The play has the porosity, big porosity. The oil moved from the source rock to the reserve rocks. But the shale is really the source rock. According to the petrogeology theory and the statistic of the practice, 85 to 90% of the oil and gas generated within the source rock still kept in the source rock. Now the shale revolution is really make the source rock become the produced layer. No need for very detailed explore. You just drilling. You know the source rock there. You just drill. And also when you get to the sweet spot, the production just as much as the conventional. So that's really shortening the time drilling and the producer. So when the price really goes down, the oil company just can no further drilling. No further drilling. When the oil price goes up, they just get further drilling. More drilling, they get a more producer out. Very quick. Now, how much days for the horizontal well drilling and fracture? 10 days, something? Yeah, 10 days. Really, when you put the rig on, you can get the production very, very high. And due to the source rock is very tight, so the production becomes very high, very quick goes to the peak and the drop quick, but can be lasted quite long, on 20 to 30% of the peak. So that's it. That's I say the marginal profit is working, can be very.
They don't stop drilling a well, they just don't drill a new one. Is that what goes on?
No. They drill it. They can
They
reduce.
cap the well?
They cap the well.
So they literally,
They can reflect it, and they can drill only within the sweet spot. Not like no need the big investment for long term.
so
That's
in
why.
this period of decreasing, dropping oil prices, how much has US production dropped since in the last
Since
15?
the July 2014, drilling activity already dropped 70% US, 70%.
What's production drop?
But the production dropped only 10%. Only 10%.
So a million barrels, roughly,
Yeah, not million yet.
or less. What's our production?
90%, 90 million, 900,000 barrels a day now.
Okay.
So it's really the marginal.
Meghan, the
Sure.
geopolitical implications of this.
And I think you're referring to this notion of energy independence,
Well,
which,
not really, but export and
Okay.
import being equal. So where an oil, a price shock wouldn't have, or,
well, I mean, that's one way in which people describe energy independence. And as many of you in this room may know, this is an idea that every American president has flirted with since Nixon. You know, that you can actually watch Jon Stewart do a really funny clip of every president since Nixon saying, we're gonna end our dependence on foreign oil. And I would say that really, with this new energy revolution in the United States, it's the first time that this conversation was not really just fanciful, you know, and there was some prospect that actually maybe the United States would get to a position where it would be able to be self-sufficient in some way. I would distinguish between two things, and that would be, well, actually, there's many distinctions to make, but to make it simple, we need to talk about energy. You said net imports of energy and oil, because the prospects for these two things are very different. The United States, even with a drop in production, and this is really a question for Howard back there, but it's still quite feasible that the United States, in sometime in the next 10 years, will have its energy imports and its energy exports equal. And energy, I'm talking about coal, oil, and gas all together, and I'm also talking about net imports and exports. So that's one parameter that is feasible. The question of actually having, having our own oil, not having to import oil, is a different, obviously a different benchmark, and there really isn't a realistic prospect of that. I think people who look at the numbers never really were banking on the United States being able to supply all of its own oil demand maybe, and still possibly quite likely, Canada, Mexico, and the US collectively could meet their own oil demand. But the point about both of these benchmarks is that in both of them, the United States is still involved in the global market. So the US is still connected to the global market. And in that case, these metrics, these numbers don't have as much political or geopolitical meaning. So, you know, if you tell me that our net imports and exports of energy are equal, we're still connected to the global market, which means we're still going to be affected by shocks that happen in the Middle East or in other parts of the world. So I think that the whole idea of energy independence, if you define it narrowly in terms of when we hit some number related to exports and imports, is really not that meaningful. But that doesn't mean that where we are and the energy that we have, the energy changes that have happened don't have big strategic implications. Because to me, energy independence doesn't really mean you don't import anybody's oil. It means that you don't need to shape your foreign policy around oil concerns, that actually, you know, you actually can make your foreign policy with a lot less of an eye on your energy needs. Because you think about it, it's really all about, you know, using your national means to advance your goals overseas. And if you can kind of take away the need to secure vast quantities of oil, then you have a little bit more freedom of action. And I'm sure China would feel that way as well, if China had less of a need to find global sources of oil. So I think that we're in a position where the big energy changes don't put us in that fantasy land of energy independence, but they do give us a boost on American both hard and soft power.
Very interesting. Joanna, the press in the last 4 days have reported that we may have seen a drop in China's CO2 emissions. And we have, as you, I guess, as pointed out, we have seen a drop in coal use. In November of the year before last, when President Obama was in Beijing, a big deal was made over the agreement that he reached with President Xi that China's emissions would peak in 2025. 2030, so it's even worse, 2030. If this data is correct, what kind of agreement was that for America? Is this, I shouldn't say it, but is this a Trump kind of point where, what did you negotiate, guys? You weren't very tough if they reached it anyhow in 2015 versus they agreed to 2030. What kind of concession was that?
It's a good question. And, you know, I think that there's been a lot of interesting reactions, right, to the numbers that have been coming out. I think the way to look at this is, so coal consumption is definitely going down, right? We can look at those numbers, but we don't actually yet know if coal use has peaked in China because we don't know what's going to happen next year. So you can speculate on that and ask all the modeling experts in the room, right? So where we are on that, but so at least in the short term, coal use peaked in 2013. Carbon emissions is a slightly more complicated calculation because while coal is by far the largest source of carbon emissions in China, it's not the only source. So while coal use is declining, other energy sources are still increasing. So again, you actually see conflicting calculations of where China's emissions are today. But I think, again, the much more important question is when will they peak? And I think it's pretty safe to say that we likely have not yet seen a peak in China's overall carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, 2030 does now seem a long way off. I think that this is a target that, when put forward, was by almost all measures and by almost all scenarios that have been put out by Chinese experts, U.S. experts, an aggressive target. You know, you can look at studies that show to get to a 2030 emissions peak, you need to scale up renewables substantially. You need coal use to drop dramatically. You need energy efficiency to be increased dramatically. And, you know, and yet we now see with this sort of very rapid coal decline in the last 2 years, we're on a new trajectory, which could make this target come sooner, the peak come sooner. But I think it's too early to say. I think, this gets back to what Mr. Liu was talking about with the broader economic transition. And the question is, are we in a sort of a permanent new normal with China, this shift away from heavy industry, or is this a more short-term sort of result of the economic situation and downturn there that will rebound with stimulus and other incentives? I think you also want to kind of look at the Chinese target side by side with the U.S. target in some ways, because of, to the extent that they were announced together back in 2014, and you asked about the U.S. The sort of the relationship behind those numbers being announced simultaneously. I think the U.S. target remains also quite aggressive in light of sort of where we are, even with the declining emissions and even with the shale gas and unconventional revolution that we've seen, where emissions have been almost flat. You still are looking at a pretty substantial decline that's going to be needed. And if you look at all the policies that are kind of in the works, assuming the Clean Power Plan goes forward, you still have a ways to go. You can't quite get to the reductions that were put forward in Paris without additional measures in the United States as well. So I think it's, this is still not going to be an easy transition for either country, and I think it's great to see, China's moving quickly along this path, but I think it's still a long road ahead to get to the sort of the sustained emissions peak.
What was the Chinese reaction to the Supreme Court decision blocking some of the efforts that President Obama had undertaken to do?
Well, I think that the sort of U.S. politics on climate change are well known in China. I think it's safe to say, and I think that really what the Obama administration has done in the absence of congressional action on climate change is what many sort of for many years thought was sort of the least best approach to dealing with climate change in the U.S., which is that sort of an absence of a federal, fully federal, flexible, market-based approach, which we were not able to get through Congress, although of course China has announced that they are going to be implementing a nationwide cap-and-trade program for carbon starting next year in an interesting twist of fate. So, I think that the Clean Power Plan can actually get you there, and the Supreme Court stay is, I think many people in Washington hope is a minor setback, which will still move forward. I think the lawyers, at least that I speak with at EPA, are confident that the basis for the policy is there. But that said, I think there's still a lot of other action still happening at the states. There are many carbon programs, mandatory carbon programs at the state level that are moving forward, even as the Clean Power Plan is on hold.
And what happens on April 22nd?
April 22nd is when, both of the presidents again last week in the joint announcement said that they will be signing the Paris Agreement. So this is sort of the first step towards ratification and implementation of the Paris Agreement. Countries are going to come forward and sign and say the significance is that this is Earth Day, and if China and the United States sort of stand up before the world and reconfirm their commitments that were made in Paris, that this will get other countries to go ahead and sign the agreement, and we can have sort of swift implementation of the targets that were put forward there.
Since we're in a law firm, I should ask the legal question. I think that this is not going to Congress for ratification. It is not a treaty, right?
No.
So it's being signed and will enter into force. It is what we used to call in the business an international agreement, which does not require Senate.
Well, the United States and
China. Not a treaty, and it doesn't require enabling legislation, correct?
The United States and China have already both ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the umbrella treaty of which the Paris Agreement is a part. So to that sense, it is already, it has standing in the United States. And then within the Paris Agreement, there are sort of specific provisions which are binding and which aren't, sort of depending on the legalese of the language. And I'll leave the rest of the explanations to the lawyers.
Yadong, my final question, then I'll open it to the audience. Why do you think Americans don't know anything about Yilu, One Belt, One Road? And why is it misunderstood? And why do some Americans, I'm quite stunned when some Americans do view it with hostility. I kind of go, what? They're lifting people out of poverty. They're building infrastructure. 10 years ago, Bob Zoellick called for China to be a responsible stakeholder, and this is a definition of responsible stakeholder. What do you think's going on here?
I think a lot depends on the political lens through which you view U.S.-China relations. Right? I mean, those who think of China as a adversary with entirely different political system and a country whose ultimate objective kind of either conflicts with that of the U.S. or even undermines capitalism, then each time you see China trying to expand its influence, you do have that kind of attitude, right? I mean, it's you think of world politics as a zero-sum game, and so if China is becoming more influential in the region, then probably China will have more influence politically as well as economically in those regions, and that's not good for the U.S. It's a kind of old-fashioned, traditional, realist school of thought.
Let me open the floor. We got a great audience. Let me open the floor to questions from the audience. Right here, and then Bob after that. Somebody with that.
Thank you, Mr. Orlins. My name is Chen. I'm a student, MIA candidate at Columbia University. Actually, this question is for Mr. Chen Weidong, and I kind of agree with your, in part of your speech when you mentioned part of the reason the U.S. is undergoing the unconventional revolution is because China is, in previous years, driving up the price of oil. Since the revolution is there and the unconventional resources price is going down, does that mean that's going to have a negative effect on the renewable energy development and research? That's a nice question. Thank you.
Very good questions. Oil is a kind of special products. High oil price, low oil price did not reduce or increase the consumption worldwide. It just go like now. The low oil price, U.S. do not have much increase their consumption. China also do not have much consumption increased by this kind of low oil price. Energy transaction is a kind of technology driving movement. Just like in China, more and more electricity car, or say the Chen. China now, most of the Chen driven by the electricity. When I were school, when I go to in the late 70s, early 80s, most of the Chen in China burned by the coal, yeah? The coal burned driving. My son come to the colleges, they take the Chen by the diesel engine, but now most the electricity. So I bought new car last October in Beijing. It's very difficult. I really lucky to get the big lottery win, so to get the car. The day when I in Beijing, every new car need the inspection when the process to buy. In that morning, 100 new cars waiting on the line to do the inspections. I count on how many. I try to find out how many electricity cars in the hundreds, over 30. Pure electricity car in the 100 is big percentages due to Beijing government 1/3 the cost will paid by.
What about your car?
No, road trip. Also, the battery car no need to do the road trip. Also, no need to stop one day a week. So make lots of policy driving to make the electricity car goes on. So it's not directly linked the renewable or the new energy usage with the oil price. That's my answer.
Robert Petersak from Sidley Austin. Following up on comments by Joanna and Weidong. Whether or not China's metrics have reached their peak yet, it does seem that China is making much faster progress in meeting those peak levels right now than had been expected before. What kind of programs in China have proven to be the most successful in speeding up the process? Is it electric cars, like Weidong has referred to, or what other programs?
I think that the big progress due to we already too much coal burn, and the smoke make everybody very uncomfortable. So any progress reduce the coal use is encouraged not only by the government, also the normal people glad to see our environment be reduced. So China become the #1 country installed the windmill and the solar power. Even now, still very small percentage, only 3%. Just like Zhang Guobao said, only 3% the renewable solar and the windmill on the total electricity supply. But the society is really get driving to reduce to our coal consumption. We discussing that when the peak coal will come in. Since the government officer document is more conservative, longer time to get at the peak, but most of the expert is discussing privately, they more aggressive to try to speed up the time up to the peak coal.
I would just add briefly, I mean, as Weidong was saying, there's very aggressive regulations right now to deal with the air pollution problem, including moratoriums on building new coal plants in many of the attainment areas in eastern China. And so that has slowed, it's made it a lot harder to build new coal plants, and you see the shutdowns of many small, inefficient coal plants, which is also having a big impact overall on sort of overall capacity and performance, as well as sort of the overall process related to mining. But a lot of the, you may have heard about sort of the revised coal data that came out within the last year that showed, there was actually more coal being used than had been thought. A lot of that has to do with the fact that much of the coal being consumed in China is actually the household level and sort of the rural level, in homes and for heating and cooking. And so that's actually just sort of the piece that's much harder to measure and harder to get a handle on and harder to control. So I think in the cities and urban areas you see relatively strong regulations, but it's harder to get sort of the household level, and all of this sort of together actually affects overall air quality.
Got two hands back there.
Thank you. Richard Jordan from the Royal Academy of Science International Trust with a question for Mr. Chen Weidong. as a follow-up to the last question, did the 2008 Olympics and Paralympics spur China's drive toward cleaner, more comfortable air, if I could use that analogy, or that term? And will the 2022 Olympics help to promote China as the renewable energy capital of the world? Thank you.
You know, in China, there are special saying. We call that Olympic blue. Olympic blue, APEC blue, APEC blue, and another blue. Oh, the military paradigm blue. So, yeah. They
September 3rd.
yeah. Actually, we know where the PM 2.5 comes from. So we can measure. But the cost is really high to make the blue. The APEC blue, we measure, even stop all the major factory, the major coal-burn power plant, they cannot match the standard yet. So even including Shandong, part of Shandong, they closed down the major coal burn factories. So it's a really big cost to get the blue on the sky.
We have very little time. We had, yeah.
Oh, hi, Jerry Cunningham, Power Energy. There was an interesting discussion on the table there a few minutes ago about the public support for reducing coal consumption in China. What I found interesting, you didn't cite CO2, which is what people almost exclusively mean when they talk about clean energy. You cited smog, particulates, dirty air, things I'll add to that, benzene in the water. What one might call traditional pollution, that's sort of the clean energy movement, is focused primarily on CO2 for climate change, not all the other stuff that happens. And I guess my question, in China, how well does the public understand that there's a difference between CO2 and smog and particulates and benzene in the water? And the context of the question is, here in the US, we've had some policies that I think are counterproductive environmentally. For example, there are millions, if not billions, of mercury-laden light bulbs in landfills all throughout the country. But they used less power, so they generated, so there was less CO2 emitted to use those bulbs. But the trade-off was mercury everywhere in landfills by the billions of light bulbs. So do you see public support for clean energy eroding if the public comes to understand there's a difference between smog, particulates, polluted water versus CO2 and other greenhouse gases?
We discussing this issue on our close seminar. Yeah, China is trying to separate the pollution emission and the CO2 emission. Because the smoke everybody can see, can smell. So this is most related to PM25, PM2.5. So that's a pollution control, not the CO2 control yet. The discussion started within the professional group. Now it's more and more discussing publicly. More and more people understand the coal burning not only cost PM 2.5, also emission much higher, CO2. That's just on the education period. In China today, the coal cost is about 2.5 US dollar per MMBTU. But the gas, more clean, is cost over $10 per MMBTU. This is the big gap. We have to concern about this issue. If US do not have the shale gas revolution, may not go forward on the, climate agreements, just like W. Bush did not want to sign the Tokyo Protocol. The same. China is faced the same situation right now. We go to more clean, or we to reduce our economic growth or the normal people quality of the daily life. Even though the pollution also become part of the daily life, but still got many other things linked to the daily life as well. So the cost, the economic big gap on the price. So we have to go two steps. First of all, we control the pollution, control the PM 2.5. Then we go to reduce the CO2 emission. That will be very reality problems. We understand, and the more public now understand that.
We have come to closing time, so first let me apologize to Binda for not getting to your question. I am sorry. And let me thank you all for coming and thank the panelists for what was a fascinating discussion.